Welcome back. Looking forward to having a chat to you about what we've got sitting in chapters 4 and 5. So we've got scholarly teaching and learning and contemporary frameworks as they sit in the notion of rules of the game. So let's have a look and see what's in those chapters. Chapter 4 begins with a really reflective look from my part about what it actually means, this scholarship of teaching and learning. Start with a little quote. The resource of the highest value in adult education is the learner's experience. If the education is life, then life is also education. Too much of learning consists of vicarious substitution of someone else's experience and someone else's knowledge. For me, being able to help students is about getting them to be able to understand the nature of their learning experience and using deep reflection. We'll talk more about that as we're going through this chapter. The chapter begins by me reflecting on what it actually means for this notion of scholarship of teaching and learning. And I consider the evolution of my scholarship of teaching and learning and think about it in the context of transformational learning. There are a series of rules which are discussed throughout this chapter, and I'm going to run through those with you to give you a bit of a sense of the sort of ground that's been covered here. Rule 12. Transformation of students. Educators play an important role in creating the possibility that transformational learning may occur. Students play an even more important role in creating the possibility that transformational learning may occur. Therefore, make sure you base your claims for the transformational learning on what your students feel, say and do, not what you feel, say or do. This is a really important part because at the end of the day, we've got to get out of the student's way, but we've got to be able to try and help them to make this learning effective. That brings us to Rule 13. Be as invisible as much as possible. Your students have been conditioned to look for you. You have most likely been conditioned to lead the way. Therefore, explain to them why you intend to disappear and make sure they know how to make you reappear. All of this discussion is flowing through, picking up on these rules. A big one, of course, is that when we're going through this process and we're handing over this control, things are going to happen which are unpredictable. So Rule 14, ask for forgiveness. Our students will delight and disappoint us in unpredictable ways. You may well have created the circumstances for this to occur. Therefore, make sure you have a well-planned explanation of unexpected events, complete with a request for forgiveness. Rule 15, students as reflective assessors. Formative and summative assessments guide student understanding for learning and ultimately provide a judgement of the student's performance at a point in time. Self-assessment as learning allows students to be more actively involved in the learning process. Therefore, we must provide a meaningful assessment role for our students to encourage and support the development of their agency. This brings us to a really important part in this chapter where we're thinking about this process of agency and how we're going to develop it. I've got a lovely little quote in there. The exercise of human agency consists in judgement and behaviour ordered by self-conscious reflection about what to think and do. Typically, this doctrine is associated with a corollary. The exercise of human agency requires accurate reflection. This is by Doris, which is cited in the book. Here, I think, is one of the greatest challenges we all face as educators, and that is how do we get students to reflect in a way that is meaningful. Now, through the book, while I don't use this diagram, I'm using this diagram to actually explain the nature of the text explanation, which is in the book. And that is, I introduce you to this notion of the STEPS model. The STEPS model enables a student to reflect on a primary question, and it could be something like, to what extent do you recognise an entrepreneurial self, in your everyday life. I then move my students for a process of answering 7 supporting questions. What have they learnt that's new about themselves? How does this relate to their values? Have their beliefs and values been challenged? I then get them to bring in some other form of life experience where those life experiences relate to this process. I get them to think about the appreciation they have or don't have of others. I get them to think about the new sources of information they've engaged with. And ultimately, I get them to step right back from that and think about their thinking. So to develop that metacognitive skills, where they try to recognize what does this process of reflection tell them about themselves as a learner, and what types of strategies could they develop. In the book, I go on to talk about this notion of different types of trajectories that their reflections can take. They can have horizontal, which is not preferred. They can have diagonal, and they can also have vertical reflection. The vertical is the type of reflection that we want. We want the students to, as they go down that steps model, to explore vertically their positions, as opposed to justifying, continuating their previous positions. Why would we want our students to engage in these processes of reflection? Well, the book is built on a little premise about this adventuring equation, which is connected to this notion of the reasonable adventurer. Adventuring is defined as multiple micro life moments of attempting to solve problems and or create new value. So I think you can agree with me that you've got students who are adventuring. We've all got students who are engaged in these micro life moments of attempting to solve problems and or create new value. And the argument being laid out in the book is that we need to allow students to develop a greater sense of their inner world and their outer world. I have particular ways of doing that, which helps them to hopefully develop greater conviction about who they are and where they're heading, and also about this process of developing a greater and more accurate perception of the world. And obviously we've got some luck we have to throw into that space as well. Rule 16, embrace awareness of self. You must develop technical knowledge of your teaching practice in order to aid the learning of your students. Technical knowledge of teaching cannot and should not drive your perspective of practice. Therefore, you must develop a broader base of knowledge about who you are, what you're attempting to do, and what context you are operating in to locate the technical knowledge that will work best for you and your students. So in wrapping up chapter 4, step back from the craziness of your day-to-day world. Invest more into developing self-awareness of yourself, your students' aims, and the context you operate within. This might require you to keep a journal, to engage with colleagues about your scholarship, and or to read about the scholarship of others. You can start this process by developing a list of questions that address your sense of who you are as an educator. Then you can explicitly start the process of questioning your perspectives of teaching and learning. You can increase your self-awareness and ultimately start a deeper conversation with yourself as to what it means to be an educator in the domain of EE. Rolling on to chapter 5, I start again with a quote from Linneman. The king, dictator, employer, or teacher who does things for others which they might have accomplished for themselves thereby weakens the capacity and worth of citizens, workers, and students. This chapter is built very much around contemporary frameworks and helping you to understand how you can help students to help themselves. Rule 17 is all about enrolling your students' heart. Humans in general care more for that which is in their hearts than that which is not. Our students are humans and all have a heart. Therefore, if we want to truly engage our students, we should afford them the opportunity to lead with their heart. This leads on neatly to Rule 18. Close boxes. We can't reduce all factors related to student learning to pedagogy. Self-determined learners need to be supported to become self-directed learners. Therefore, we must perfect the art of academagogy to ensure our students' hearts are truly central to EE. Now, the role of academagogy, which is scholarly leading, looks a little bit like this in a very simplistic way. Pedagogy, what the educator initiates, is balanced against what the student initiates. And in the middle, our desired space is andragogy, which is responsibility shared by both. So academigogy is your ability to find a balance as an educator. Sometimes you're leading pedagogically, other times you're reacting to the pedagogical interventions of your students. But at all times, the balancing act will have been achieved when we're able to achieve that self-directed learning that's informed by the interests of the student and supported by the abilities and knowledge of the educator. Which brings us to Rule 19. Dreamers who do. All entrepreneurial behaviour contains degrees of risk that can be managed or largely ignored. Many students are ill-prepared or unaware of their ability to manage risk. Therefore, we need to ensure that our students understand how to manage the risk associated with their planned behaviours. Now, I'm not going to read right through all of the principles that we discuss in the book, but there are a range of principles that relate to pedagogy, and there are a range of principles that relate to andragogy. And while there are no sort of set principles that are laid out in the literature, I've pulled together, based on the logic of the conversations and discussions in the book, these notions of what it means to develop academigogical principles. So we have those as a focus area that we can have this discussion happening within. Of course, this all leads to this notion of why are we doing what we're doing. And from my perspective, it's very much about this notion of self-negotiated action, which is where we started the discussion when we introduced the book. Self-negotiated action is defined as the agency individuals demonstrate in directing their conscious thinking and action towards an alignment of their inner and outer worlds in order to succeed in life. For some time now, I've advocated that authentic entrepreneurship education should be defined as a process of education that develops an increased capacity for self-negotiated action. In trying to address how this is relevant to all educators as a foundational sort of starting point, I've developed a signature pedagogy for entrepreneurship education. And it's built through these three philosophical positions: ontology, exology, and epistemology, and balanced against the properties of a signature pedagogy as defined by Schulman. And so you can sort of see that the principles that I'm relying on here is that in terms of ontology, what is the nature of our students' experience when first studying entrepreneurship? And I've said that really our students have naive assumptions. They face an unknown future. They have a delayed progression typically towards being an entrepreneur, and they have different educational needs. I think this is something that represents the reality of all of our students. In terms of what fundamental values guide our approach to teaching entrepreneurship, it's a very broad acceptance across the literature that our students need to learn about, for, and through entrepreneurship. Can't be just one of those approaches, it's a combination of those things. And in terms of the epistemology, how do we think our students develop knowledge of entrepreneurship? Again, there's a nice acceptance in our literature that students gain first-hand knowledge using experiential forms of learning and deep reflection that supports transformative outcomes. This leads to this notion of a signature pedagogy. And I'm not going to run through it in any great detail here, but you can see the primary assumptions on the left-hand side, where we're assuming the students can't know what they need to know. They face an unknown future. They're not going to become an entrepreneur tomorrow, so we're working on something that's well into the future, and that there are varied needs. And when we pull together this self-directed andragogical experience with a pedagogical experience, and we recognize that each student has a capacity to feel, think, and act, if we can place in front of them deep, reflective, transformational learning opportunities, we've got opportunities to develop the habits of heart, mind, and hands that would relate to this specific type of agency that we discussed just a few seconds ago. This brings us to Rule 20, uniting philosophy and practice. Philosophically speaking, educators tend to agree what the benefits and purposes of entrepreneurship education are. By and large, educators use an amazing variety of practices to educate entrepreneurship education students. Therefore, to advance our domain collectively, we should start with those practices common to all of our approaches and infuse our shared philosophical positions on top of that. So, in summary, the tools that you now have to also include a signature pedagogy for entrepreneurship education. Through its application to your context, your process of curriculum design should show increased provisions for the individuality of your students, which in turn should orient your curriculum towards experiential learning accompanied by deep and repeated reflection, thereby enabling your students to learn more about themselves and their surrounds. Importantly, your approach should never lose sight of the progress of the cohort, regardless of how much your outliers may stand out from the crowd. The next chapter offers you access to a new way to be able to see the game so that you might develop a greater capacity for your own style of entrepreneurship education. I hope that gives you a really good sense for what's in those chapters. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time when we look at chapter 6, which is about seeing the rules, the final chapter in that section. Then we can moving on to determining your purpose, which is where we start in terms of being able to play the game. All the best.